Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to the fourth of 4 lectures. Those who missed any or one or two of the others, that was just what we've been doing in the last 3 weeks. I mean, I should probably maybe say that at this point again, this is a general history for the general reader. It's not an academic treatment. I've done as much research as I could do on this. So for the sake of this series of lectures, we've just broken it down into these sort of chunks. And today is going to be the Ottomans, onto abolition, the two obviously intimately connected, and then with a few minutes at the end on modern slavery. Based on a bit of some personal travel to Mali and Mauritania, one of which was funded by the Faros Foundation, going to Mauritania. So I thought this was interesting. I kind of started out a little bit with this in mind, and I put the date there specifically. So this is essentially a generation ago, those comments from the great historian of Ottoman slavery. I mean, I would say that it is no longer a deafening silence, but I would probably characterize it as a bit of a murmur. You know, this aspect of global slavery is still in its in terms of research. I think it's still in its infancy, relatively speaking. Particularly when you compare it with the Atlantic slave trade. And around the same time as Ehud Toledano wrote those words, the Turkish historian Yusuf Hakan Erdem said something similar, and he talked about a near total collective amnesia about Ottoman slavery. So that's sort of by way of introduction to the Ottomans. 1683, peak Ottoman Empire. That's the year in which the Ottoman siege of Vienna was unsuccessful. High watermark, really, of the Ottoman Empire. And so that's the geographical spread of it, which I'm sure lots of us would know already. And these comments are from a Venetian ambassador, I think specifically talking about the Janissaries and also the Ottoman Empire, a lordship or republic of slaves, which I also like because it again turns our traditional notions of slavery on its head. You know, traditionally Atlantic slave trade in our minds, the slave is at the bottom of a particular society, not necessarily the case at all in the Ottoman Empire or in much of the Islamic world. Earliest days of the embryonic Ottoman Empire under its founder Osman I at the dawn of the 14th century are shrouded in considerable uncertainty. But for our purposes this evening on slavery, that doesn't need to concern us. I'd just say that just as the early Muslim Arabs inherited and later adapted the system of slavery from their pre-Islamic forebears, not to mention their Persian and Byzantine neighbours, so the Ottomans picked up where previous Muslim dynasties before them had left off. Carving out a territory in the Anatolian heartland from the 13th century meant raiding, and raiding meant slaving. This was as natural to Osman's Muslim Turkmen warriors as it was to the 7th century Arabs who brought Islam to the world. And from that moment, from the earliest days of the Ottoman Empire, both slavery and the slave trade were constants in Ottoman history, so for the next 620 odd years, until the empire itself collapsed. And by the early 16th century, the Ottomans had become the preeminent Islamic dynasty. The many manifestations of Ottoman slavery, from the refined captive beauties cloistered in the imperial harem, the sharp-elbowed slave soldiers turned political grandees, and the physically tortured, often hugely influential palace eunuchs, to the less celebrated silk weavers in Bursa, and the completely unheralded domestic drudges, rope makers, shipbuilders, sharecroppers, miners, carpenters, death-defying galley rowers, and many more, all resist easy generalization. The lives and stories of the great mass of slaves, men, women, and children, may be virtually impossible to discern. But if we look and listen hard enough, from time to time we find revealing snapshots of their experiences, and all too rarely, unfortunately, the poignant and unmistakable sound of their voices. If it's an exaggeration to say the Ottoman Empire was a slave state, because ultimately slavery here was too rarefied a phenomenon to define an entire society. And unlike the American plantation version, it never underpinned any system of mass production. Slavery, nevertheless, was completely fundamental to the Ottoman Empire. The royal household system of slavery alone, in which all power-wielding officials, from the most distant governors and military commanders in far-flung places to the viziers in the imperial palace in Istanbul, were the Sultan's slave servants. This was completely fundamental to Ottoman rule. And in the words of Halil İnalcık, the great Turkish historian of the empire, it was the foundation stone of the Ottoman state, that royal household system of slavery. So no matter how senior you were technically a slave of the Sultan. And there was that life or death power over you as well. You might be at the very top, and the Sultan may simply give an order off with his head. Increasingly rare as the empire, as the centuries passed, but that relationship was still there. Just to kind of, because we're covering some aspects that we've looked at before, those past 3 lectures we've covered some of the main categories of enslavement. We might call it elite slavery, but the world outside domestic servitude, which we know less about. These apply, of course, as much to the Ottomans as to previous Muslim dynasties. So we looked at eunuchs. These were 2 gentlemen, the chiefs of the black and white eunuchs, respectively, in the early 18th century court of Sultan Ahmed III. We looked at concubines, and perhaps that greatest rags to riches story of Hürrem Sultan, or Roxolana, who went from beautiful Ukrainian peasant girl to slave concubine to the dizzying heights of lawfully wedded wife of Sultan Süleyman. Perhaps the greatest ruler of the Ottoman Empire at its mighty moment. And she also is a reminder, again, that slavery was literally in the Ottoman dynasty's DNA. Unlike the Umayyads, but just like the Abbasids, the Ottomans favoured concubinage over marriage as the means to produce royal heirs. And it's one of the reasons, I think, when it comes to the 19th century and you have this protracted correspondence between British officials and the Ottoman government, that it's almost like a dialogue of the deaf. The Ottomans just don't understand why they're under sort of siege from the British, because their system of slavery is so different from the slavery that they believe the British are protesting about. We looked at slaves. We looked at the harvesting of bureaucrats and slave soldiers from the Caucasus, the annual devshirme, the harvest of the youngsters there, either given voluntarily by impoverished parents or forcibly taken. And we looked at slave soldiers, including the janissaries, the elite muscle of the Ottoman Empire. And a final word on slave soldiers. Like both eunuchs and concubines, they lasted well over a millennium, from the earliest days of Islam in the 7th century well into the 19th century. Perhaps not as long as concubines. Though it wavered over the centuries and was far less prevalent in the later Ottoman Empire than in the early period, slaving through raiding and conquest continued from the time of Osman, the founder in the 14th century, through to bloody instances of mass enslavement like the massacre at Chios in the 19th century, which we'll come to in a moment, and beyond abolition to the final fall of the empire. And we have a rare European eyewitness from the 15th century who had the misfortune, some might call it good fortune, to experience Ottoman slavery and live to tell his tale. Konstantin Mihailović was a Serbian youth whose first-hand experience of Ottoman conquest and enslavement electrified his much later memoirs. As a soldier of the vassal Serbian state, he claimed to have fought in the multi-ethnic army of Sultan Mehmed II, which took Constantinople in 1453. 2 years later, 2 years after Constantinople fell, he and the fortress town of Novo Brdo in Kosovo found themselves on the wrong end of another 40-day Ottoman siege. And eventually the town bowed to the inevitable. The immediate consequences of defeat were dire: mass execution and wholesale enslavement. And these are now Mihailovic's words. After the city surrendered, the Sultan himself had the gates closed, leaving open only one exit. The survivors were told to walk through the gate, and on the other side they were separated and placed into groups. Boys in one area, girls in another, women in a third, and men in a fourth place. On the spot, he had the important men immediately beheaded. He then selected 320 boys and 704 girls. The girls he gave to his soldiers and took the boys for himself to become his janissaries. The remainder were allowed to return to the city. Mihailovich was one of those boys taken to be a janissary, and in time he rose through the ranks and was promoted to a senior command in the cavalry, serving in campaigns against Vlad III, the Impaler of Wallachia and in Bosnia, before being taken prisoner again, this time by Christian forces under the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus, and finally repatriated. And among his many observations in this memoir, he noted that sort of almost entrepreneurial relish with which the Ottomans embarked on slave raiding. It was under Sultan Mehmed, or Fatih Mehmed the Conqueror, shown here in the famous portrait by Bellini, that slaves began to be employed in the Ottoman bureaucracy for the first time. Mehmed had very personal reasons for doing this. When he was deposed initially in 1446, it was by a grand vizier whose family had already supplied 3 previous grand viziers before him. So this was an elder statesman of great prominence and distinction. He also was the elder statesman who had argued strongly against the siege of Constantinople and had argued against it with the senior generals at a time when mutiny was almost, virtually on the cards. So he'd been a great thorn in Mehmed's side. Once the ancient Christian capital had been taken, Mehmed bowed to no one anymore and had the man immediately executed. So his next innovation after that was to throw officialdom wide open to the slave class, so much so that his grand viziers over the next few decades, with the final exception, were overwhelmingly of slave origin. So you're cutting out the old aristocracy and replacing his senior officials with from a slave background. I put that into perspective. Of the first 48 grand viziers who followed, who served sultans after Mehmed's conquest in 1453, only 5 were native-born Turks. Little wonder that some Turks referred to the Sultan's imperial diwan or council contemptuously as the slave market. These traditions persisted far longer than might be expected. 4 centuries later, the British naval officer Adolphus Slade, a regular visitor to Istanbul from the 1820s, reckoned that 80% of the ministers in the council of the Sultan Mahmud II were purchased slaves. A little bit later, when Nassau Senior, the British economist and lawyer, visited Istanbul in the mid-1850s, he was told by an Armenian official that virtually the entire cabinet of ministers were former slaves. In fact, Stefan Bey and Edem Pasha are the only ministers that occurred to me who have not been slaves, the Armenian said. So again, that gives you sort of the context of when those discussions are being held on abolition between the British and the Ottomans. That's obviously a huge difference between the people involved, and they essentially do not understand each other. Enslavement on the battlefield continued for centuries, and it could occur even when there was no conquest. This is, I think, a very good example of that. In 1683, notwithstanding their defeat by the combined Christian forces of the Holy League at the Siege of Vienna, a moment from when, according to one famous verdict, the Ottomans ceased to be a menace to the Christian world, the Ottomans still managed to leave the battlefield with a staggering number of captives, 50,000 children, 25,000 females, and 6,000 adult males. A little bit later, in 1822, the Ottomans captured the Greek island of Chios in a very bloody intervention, imagined here by the French artist Eugène Delacroix. Up to 20,000 Greeks were slaughtered, hanged, starved, and tortured to death in this 1822 massacre. A bloody chapter in the Greek War of Independence which shocked and disgusted Europe. Large numbers of islanders were raped and deported. The island itself was devastated, and so many Chiots were enslaved that they were sold for as little as 50 kurush, which equated to something like 10% of what a mid-ranking Ottoman official earned in a month, because they were just, to a penny. One of those enslaved in Chios was a Greek Orthodox toddler aged about 3. He was purchased by a man called Husrev Pasha, Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, taken into his household, converted to Islam, was given a new name, and then educated in France, where he qualified as an engineer after completing his studies at the École des Mines. He was a quick study and returning to Istanbul rose through the state bureaucracy until in 1877, around the time this picture was taken, he reached the summit of power, Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, so the equivalent of a prime minister to a president. Enslaved at age 3, Grand Vizier in his much later life. So again, it's that instance of that little sort of meritocratic window through which meritocratic window of opportunity through which the best and the brightest, and perhaps above all the luckiest, could leap. And this is his great-great-grandson, Edem Eldem, doyen of Turkish historians, now at Columbia, who I interviewed in his home in Istanbul for the book. And among the many interesting things he said to me was, I think, a very straightforward point, a caution about seeing these rags to riches stories as representative of Ottoman slavery writ large, and these were his words. For every little Greek boy who was lucky enough to become a pasha, thousands were slaughtered and thousands of others were destined to spend the rest of their lives as domestic slaves or inmates of harems. We mustn't forget all those who never made it. Because, this sort of historian, the journalist, the storyteller will hone in on these lovely stories, but they aren't representative of slavery writ large, of course. This is obviously one of the more interesting aspects of the story as you come towards the end of slavery in the Islamic world. That sort of combination of paradox and pressure. I mean, this is obviously the same man talking about this. All of this historical background obviously suggests to us that after half a millennium of slavery, the Ottomans were not necessarily going to welcome with open arms the increasingly muscular, often impassioned and fairly relentless British pressure for abolition. And looking at the paradox a little bit here, on the one hand, of course, you have the Quran and Sharia law explicitly permitting slavery. It had been sanctioned by the Prophet Muhammad and had endured, generally without controversy, throughout 1,300 years of Islamic history. On the other hand, as the Sultan says in 1851, the slave trade looked increasingly at odds with the march of civilization. And there was heavy British pressure on top of that on the Ottomans to abolish it at a time when the state was increasingly weak. The view from many, perhaps most Ottomans and Arabs was, of course, very different. Many felt the British and wider European moves on abolition were merely cover for gobbling up an empire. And for them, abolition was, in the words of one historian, imperialism spelt differently. Bit of context on the dates of abolition. Generally, the Islamic world, abolition coming later. But look at the date of Tunisia, pipping France to the post by a couple of years. And that 1990 declaration has been described as the Islamic world's version of the UN's 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Because time is limited and because this is a general history, you have to forgive me at the risk of generalizing a little bit. Talking about the Ottoman reform, I think the word piecemeal is probably fairly accurate description of it. You're talking about decades of often reluctant foot dragging and equivocation, interspersed with moments of zealous young Turk liberalization. And you have this sort of flow of narrowly focused firmans, imperial decrees, pertaining to the slave trade. You have a geographically specific suppression here, the outlawing of a specific category there, and a sense of progress towards a clear yet distant goal. But equally, you have a sort of confusing blurring of ostensible reform with decades of contradiction and continuation of both slavery and the slave trade. So you have maneuvering, skullduggery, innovation, conservatism, liberalism, and denial. If you look at the last date, I think this I think for me a key point and an important one and a fair one. You realise that slavery was never abolished in the Ottoman Empire. We will come on to that in a moment as well. For years, Istanbul's central slave market, the largest in the Ottoman Empire, as depicted here by the British Orientalist Sir William Allen, had occupied a sweep of prime property in the heart of the imperial capital between Nuro Osmaniye Mosque and Gazi Atik Ali Pasha Mosque, in what is today the area of Cembelitaş, around the shop-crowded surroundings of the Grand Bazaar. Its physical presence in the centre of the city symbolised its complete centrality to social and commercial life. And then in an order of 28th of December 1846, Sultan Abdul Majid abolished the slave market at a stroke. His motivations, according to an Ottoman court historian, were entirely humanitarian. The Sultan had heard of some quote-unquote troubles in the market, for which probably read maltreatment of slaves, which contradicted holy law. Immediately, the closure of the market broke up the Slave Dealers Guild, who were the regulator of the trade in Istanbul, and immediately and inevitably forced the trade underground. It didn't go away. 20 years after its abrupt closure, there were large slave-dealing businesses operating in, among other places, the Tophane quarter of Beyoğlu, Istanbul's first industrial zone, which ran downhill from Galata to the Bosphorus, and also across the Golden Horn, opposite the Süleymaniye Mosque in the Fatih district, named after Mehmet. So if that 1846 move against the slave market was Ottoman in motivation, it was British diplomatic pressure which led to the Sultan's suppression of the slave trade in the Gulf in 1847, his prohibition of the Circassian slave trade in 1854, and the general outlawing of the African slave trade in 1857. And I think I'd probably stress that for most of this period, it was African slavery, which was the main focus of Western abolitionist energies and attention. That was where the diplomatic thrust was most intense. However, at times, white Circassian slavery also exercised European minds. So in August 1854, at the height of the Crimean War, when France and Britain were fighting alongside Ottoman forces against Russia, both countries submitted formal notes to the Ottoman government calling for the prohibition of the Circassian slave trade and the sale of these people in Istanbul. In his letter of 29th of August 1854 to the Ottoman government, Lord Stratford de Redcliffe, I don't think you get many British ambassadors called that these days, but that was the ambassador in 1854. In his letter, he noted that the enslavement of Muslim Circassians was illegal under Islamic law, and that of Christian Georgians was offensive to the Allies, quote, without whose cooperation the very existence of the Turkish Empire would be endangered. Far too many barbarous practices, he said, such as the shipping of Georgian children on an Austrian steamer to Istanbul, where they'd been sold off as slaves to a senior official, had been brought to light. At a time when the ambassador wrote, Christian powers have sent their armies and squadrons into Turkey for its defense, and when those armies and squadrons, composed of Christians, are fighting side by side with Mussulmans and confounding all differences of religion in the cause of humanity and national independence, they set at naught every calculation and excite the most unqualified disgust. On 18th of September, less than 3 weeks after that letter, the Council of Ministers met in Istanbul, and the Grand Vizier Mehmet Emin Pasha reminded the cabinet that the Allies' ultimate objective, as the Turks knew, the Ottomans knew, was the abolition of slavery. A total prohibition of the Georgian and Circassian slave trade could result in what he termed the closing of the gate of slavery, which was, of course, undesirable. So an equilibrium had to be sought. And those were his words. The carefully calibrated solution was a brace of firmans, decrees again, sent to the commander of the Ottoman army on Georgia's Black Sea coast. Both decrees prohibited the export of slaves from Georgia and the Circassian coast respectively, though there were important differences, most significant being one of religion. As a Muslim people outside his empire, the Circassians could not be prohibited from slave trading, a major source of income for them, especially during an economically crippling conflict with Russia. So you have this, again generalizing, but you have this dynamic playing out across the 19th century during which Ottoman reforms emerged and then sometimes backtracked or were ignored as European attention and diplomatic pressure on abolition ebbed and flowed like the tide. Abolition was, as everyone knew, extremely sensitive. Perhaps nowhere was it more sensitive than in the Hijaz, home of the holy places of Medina and Mecca, lodestars of Islam. And here, opposition to Ottoman measures to curb the slave trade led to rioting and rebellion. even before that firman against the African trade had been announced. That's the Vilayet, Ottoman province of Hijaz in the Arabian Peninsula. You can see at the top northwest, and in a little bit greater detail then on the right-hand side. By 1855, rumours that such a move on abolition was imminent were causing profound unease. The flames of rebellion were cunningly fanned by Abdul Muttalib, the Sharif of Mecca, who had his own political agenda entirely separate from the question of slavery and abolition. And that agenda was to end Ottoman power in the Hijaz altogether. So he prepared a letter, purportedly from the merchants and other communities in the Hijaz, specifically designed to inflame Arab feeling against the Ottomans. How could these infidel regulations be applied to us, the letter asked? How could Muslims tolerate this commingling with infidels in everything? Istanbul learned of the plot and dispatched a senior official to investigate. An order was then given by this man, Kamil Pasha, the Ottoman governor of Jeddah, closing the slave markets and prohibiting the slave trade. The reaction in Mecca and across the Hijaz was immediate and furious. When the order was read out in public at the Sharia court on the 30th of October 1855, in front of the clergy and sharifs, there was uproar. Sheikh Jamal, head of the clerics, issued a Fari fatwa declaring the order void because it violated Islamic law. With this order against the slave trade, he raged, the Turks had revealed themselves as apostates. It was therefore perfectly permissible to kill them with impunity and, a macabre flourish of irony, even enslave their children. A jihad was declared against the Christians and idolaters, which now included Muslim Ottomans. Houses belonging to English and French residents were looted, and Ottoman garrisons were attacked by rampaging mobs. The clerics demanded that Istanbul remove both the judge and the Ottoman garrison from Mecca, insisted on their freedom to continue practicing slavery, and called for the expulsion of the consuls and all Christians from the Hijaz. Abdul Muttalib was summarily deposed, but he refused to accept his dismissal. He wrote to the Bedouin chiefs, calling on them to, quote, rise in the name of Muhammad and the true faith, as the Sultan has become a Christian, the same as the Frank. The rebellion was only suppressed with his arrest and exile 7 months later. All this turbulence understandably had alarmed Istanbul, and after this most severe of shocks to the empire, in the sacred, deeply conservative epicenter of the faith, it was little surprise that the 1857 firman against the African trade was then tweaked, specifically to exclude the Hijaz. From now on, it was business as usual. Reform wasn't for everyone. So, returning for a moment to the heart of the Ottoman Empire, across the long 19th century, we find that for all the reformist zeal exhibited for so long in so many areas, despite all the firmans and the British and other foreign pressure directed at successive sultans, there is one inescapable fact which brings the subject into focus. Slavery was never abolished in the Ottoman Empire. It outlived both the Sultanate, abolished in 1922, and the Caliphate, eliminated in 1924. At the time of the empire's final dissolution on the 1st of November 1922, after 623 years dominating the Middle East, North Africa, and swathes of the Mediterranean and southeastern Europe, slavery still lingered like an unpleasant smell. An intermittently prosecuted campaign of sometimes punitive, sometimes token strikes against the slave trade may have left this commerce in men, women, and children unrecognizable and virtually invisible at the death knell of empire, but slavery itself persisted. It was telling that formal legal abolition was achieved finally not through domestic legislation, not after public protest or a spirited campaign, but in the clinical, bureaucratic prose of an international treaty which Turkey took several years to approve. Only in 1933, when the 10-year-old Turkish Republic ratified the 1926 League of Nations Convention on the Suppression of Slavery, was it all over. But of course, it was never completely over. That would be far too neat. Just as dictatorships do not die with the death of a dictator, but live on in mindsets and mentalities, customs and practices, and all too often the politics and the institutions of government, so slavery became, if no longer a lived experience, then a real and living memory for vast numbers of men, women, and children from one end of the Ottoman world to the other. Its spectre cast a long shadow whose darkness can still be discerned today. At the most basic level, of course, this is hardly surprising when you consider that it has lasted for the entire duration of the empire, from the first clash of swords, Osman's and his men's swords on the Byzantine frontier in the early 14th century to its annihilation in the 20th. In the early years of Kemal Atatürk's Republic of Turkey, slavery was, according to one verdict, at best forgotten or exoticized, and at worst denied but never confronted. Once the era of slavery had given way to abolition and emancipation, from that moment, if not before, slavery was something to be dusted under the carpet. It was swept out of sight, put away and forgotten as though it had never happened. There was nothing to see here. A new post-imperial generation of Turks could be forgiven for not knowing anything about it, as they would know little or nothing of the Armenian genocide. Instead of a lively discussion in school textbooks and university lecture halls, there was a deafening silence as what has been called the new Republican, quote, project of regulated amnesia, unquote, got underway. In some, perhaps many quarters, this selective amnesia and denial has persisted into the 21st century. And I remember the words of a young Turkish historian I met in Istanbul, and she was at an early stage of a career looking at Ottoman slavery specifically. And she described how she went to see an older professor, a historian in the university, who she wanted to be her supervisor, and told him what she wanted to study for her PhD in Ottoman slavery. And he sort of brushed her off and with these words, "Our ancestors treated their slaves very well. Don't waste your time with this." That was his response to her wanting to do a doctorate in Ottoman slavery, and that wasn't that long ago. So what about the descendants of enslaved Africans in Turkey today? Until as recently as 2005, very little was heard from them. Then a writer and activist called Mustafa Olpak published his autobiography, which told the devastating story of how his Kenyan ancestors had been enslaved and taken to Istanbul. His account gave the lie to the complacent and widespread assumption that Ottoman slavery was invariably benign, that everyone had always treated their slaves well. It offered a very different narrative. First captured in Kenya, an African couple with a young child called Ahmed, Olpak's grandfather, were put on sale in Crete. There they were purchased by a Turkish family and forced to work on the farm. When the father died, the teenage Ahmed, who as a child had been locked in an iron cage after failed attempts to escape, was forced by his owners to marry his stepmother, Nuria, in order to keep the family together under a new patriarch. Ahmed from then on had to call the woman whom he considered to be his mother, his wife. "It's unimaginable," he wrote, but that is what happened. His ordeal was far from over. In 1918, as the empire teetered towards collapse, Nuria was sold to new owners in Istanbul, despite desperate pleas from the couple not to separate them. Once she was gone, the masters announced their new plan to keep the family together. Ahmed was to marry again, this time one of Nuria's sisters. Again, as a slave, he was unable to refuse and duly married the woman he had known as his sister-in-law. Nuria never forgave him for this, nor for allowing her sale to the family in Istanbul, not that he could have in any way stopped it. Olpak's book here caused a stir in a society which had largely glossed over its slaving past, and which the descendants of emancipated African slaves had to contend with what one historian has described as a near total non-recognition of their unique history, as well as discrimination in their daily lives. I would say that's now changing, and there are ongoing efforts to raise awareness of this underexposed history. Today, many of the country's estimated tens of thousands of Afro-Turks, as the community is known, still live in the Aegean region around Izmir, descendants of the enslaved Africans who worked the cotton fields near the port city of Smyrna. Slavery may have disappeared in Turkey, but for some members of this community, the prejudice and discrimination against them has not. In 2016, a retired tobacco factory worker called Ahmed described how this affected him. When mothers passed him on the street with their children, he said, they muttered superstitious phrases under their breath. Whether you like it or not, it does get to you, he said bleakly. They pray that their children will not turn out so black. They touch wood and look away from me. Even today, some members of this community still have the surname Zenchi, a derogatory word which, like the Arabic Zanj, is an approximate equivalent to the word Negro. Afro-Turks are often casually called Arabs as well, a term Turks have traditionally used for people with darker skin. In Ahmed's words, we call ourselves Arab too. It is better than African, which has such bad connotations in Turkey. Never mind that in so many cases, the raids in which their ancestors had been enslaved had been perpetrated by Arab slavers. Olpak saw himself as part of a natural process of evolving attitudes and approaches to slavery and its enduring legacy. He spelt this out in the first words of his book. The first generation lives, the second reacts, the third researches. I am Mustafa Olpak. In my family, I'm third generation. Olpak died in 2016, but the research he began continues. Had they been asked to explain why slavery within the Islamic world endured so long, the 19th century British would not have been lost for an answer. As James Gray Jackson, a British consul in Morocco, in the Atlantic port town of Mogador, which many of you will know as today's Essaouira, in the early 19th century put it, quote, "The pride and arrogance of the Moors is unparalleled, for though they live in the most deplorable state of ignorance, slavery and barbarism, yet they consider themselves the first people in the world and contemptuously term all others barbarians." So I sort of responded to those comments by Jackson in this extract from the book. This baleful verdict revealed as much about the British, of course, as it did about the Moroccans. As recent research has demonstrated, it is simply not the case that strong voices on abolition never emerged within the Muslim world. There were scholars such as the jurist and theologian Jafar ibn Muhammad al-Sadiq, Hamdan Qamat, the 9th century founder of the Qarmatian Ismaili movement in Iraq, Al-Hakim, the Fatimid ruler of Egypt, the Tunisian reformer Mohammed Bayram Khamis, the Moroccan historian Ahmed al-Nasiri, the Indian philosopher and modernist Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, Muhammad Abdu, Grand Mufti of Egypt, and the anti-Western Islamic revivalist Rashid Rida, all of whom advanced moral arguments, often based on the Quran, justifying their positions on abolition. Some Muslim writers, including the Indian jurist and historian Sayyid Amir Ali and the Egyptian writer and statesman Ahmed Shafiq, also advanced the case that Islam had always meant to abolish slavery, but that the institution was so rooted in 7th century life on the Arabian Peninsula that the immediate abolition would have wrecked the Prophet Muhammad's mission to spread the faith before it had started. In this, they were echoing some of the arguments made by British and American abolitionists when asked why Jesus had neither condemned nor outlawed slavery. Such voices, however, tended to be relatively isolated and did not by themselves constitute a fully fledged indigenous abolitionist movement. This is inevitably contentious territory, and there are some Muslim scholars who have argued, for example, that the Islamic tradition would never have contributed meaningfully to a European-led abolitionist movement, and that Sharia holy law lacked an internal mechanism which would have allowed slavery to be abolished. Any analysis also needs to acknowledge that the abolitionist movement arose at a time when Europe was starting to dominate Muslim lands, and that it was widely understood as part of a systematic effort, Western effort, to undermine and attack the Dar al-Islam, the Islamic world. As Jonathan Brown, the Al-Walid bin Talal Chair of Islamic Civilization at Georgetown, has written in this book on the left, the narrative of the West awakening to slavery's inherent evil and then dragging the Orient, Africa, and everything else that was not the West into the light by means of inspiration and force has been crucial to the formation of Western identity. The heat of those 19th century debates between mostly Western opponents and mostly Muslim defenders of slavery, I think, is echoed in some scholarly clashes today. The historian Dalia Gubara, a professor of history at Koç University in Istanbul, for example, argues that the very histories of slavery and the slave trade in the Middle East are so problematic that they constitute, in her words, a liberal incitement to racial discourse. A key problem with such an adversarial approach is that it can easily slide into nothing to see here denial. Some academics, meanwhile, argue that critical discussions in this field are guilty of otherizing Arabs, Muslims, and Africans. Interestingly, Gubara also notes that in 2010, the late Libyan leader Colonel Gaddafi, of all people, publicly apologized to Africa on behalf of Arab states for their role in enslaving Africans. These are his words. On behalf of the Arabs, I condemn, apologize, and regret the behavior of Arabs towards their African brothers. He too regretted the by now proverbial culture of silence. It was, he said, a sensitive issue that has never been tackled before. That's Gaddafi. As with so many aspects of slavery in the Islamic world, there is no shortage of paradoxes. While Islam was at pains to regulate the institution of slavery from the outset and was outspoken in calling upon the faithful to free their slaves, nevertheless, in the words of this author of the study of abolition in slavery in Islam, Muslim diehards have generally lagged behind those in other faiths in endorsing complete emancipation and abolition. It would, of course, be a mistake to think abolition was the end of the story. Fast forward to 2014. In the summer of that year, the organization that the Western media often call Islamic State, but which I prefer to, like many Arabs, to use the pejorative word Daesh, stormed into northern Iraq and killed, enslaved, and raped thousands of Yazidis. This is the self-styled Sheikh Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, who was the former Daesh spokesperson and also a cheerleader for the enslavement and rape of Yazidi women. And in that article published in this issue of the in-house Daesh magazine, Dabik, The Revival of Slavery Before the Hour, he boasted, "We will conquer your Rome, break your crosses, and enslave your women." A couple of years later, he disappeared when he was killed in the US airstrike. But he'd made his position fairly clear. I should probably be pointing at this, shouldn't I? A UN report in 2016, so 2 years after that invasion of northern Iraq, concluded that Daesh had committed genocide, multiple crimes against humanity, and war crimes against the Yazidis, who were subjected to what the report called almost unimaginable horrors. And so, again, this is an extract from the book. Resistance took many forms. Some women smeared their babies' excrement on their bodies to avoid being bought. Some claimed to have periods. Others stopped bathing. Some professed to be sick. Some fought back. At least one woman killed her owner and escaped. Many received punishment beatings, were separated from their children, locked up in hot, crowded basements amid rising sewage, and starved for their refusal to submit to sexual violence. Many did not see daylight for months. Several described the conditions as being like hell. In 2017, so a year later, the Kuwaiti cleric Salim bin Saad al-Tawil declared on his YouTube channel that slavery was, quote, one of the virtues of Islam, end quote, because it gave infidels the chance to convert to Islam and thereby escape hell. He had no time for those who argued that there was no slavery in Islam. And again, his words, "Some people are trying to shrug it off and say there is no slavery in Islam. How can you say this? It is in the Quran." I would emphasize that this is not a representative Muslim voice at all, but it is a minority strand of opinion. This gentleman is an imam under the Ministry of Islamic Affairs in Kuwait. This gentleman is another cleric, this time Saudi, Sheikh Saleh al-Fawzan, who had and apparently still has strong views on slavery and its place in Islam. Again, these are his words. "Slavery is a part of Islam. Slavery is part of jihad, and jihad will remain as long as there is Islam." Now, it would be tempting to dismiss al-Fawzan as a lone voice of extremism, yet when he made these remarks, he stood at the very pinnacle of the Saudi religious establishment, where he remains today. He was a member of the Senior Council of Clerics, the country's highest religious body, a professor at Imam Mohammed bin Saud Islamic University, the principal Wahhabi center of learning, a member of the Council of Religious Edicts and Research, and Imam of the Prince Mutayyib Mosque in Riyadh. Al-Fawzan was many things, but an unsupported Saudi Arabian maverick and lone wolf he was and is not. Modern slavery remains a curse in parts of the Muslim world, and I discuss its existence in the US and UK, among other countries too. And I went to Mauritania, which we'll come on to in a moment, and I was having an interview with someone from a government think tank. Everything is controlled by the government there. And he got very defensive with me, and I just said, he said, you've got slavery in the UK too? And I said, yes, we do. But he denied it existed in Mauritania. And I thought what was fairly obvious about that discussion is it's quite difficult to deal with an issue if you deny it even exists. This gentleman I met when I first started the book in 2020. I was working in Mali at the time, and I met him in Bamako, the capital. And although it's illegal, of course, hereditary racialized slavery still continues in parts of the country. Hami, his name is, was born into slavery and came from a long line of enslaved men and women. One day in 2018, he refused to continue and was given a savage public beating and whipping before being expelled from his village. The mayor of the town later said, you should have killed him, instead of the typical thing that was filmed, then went on social media and caused a stir, obviously. But the mayor's words were, you should have killed him. You know, you're just bringing back, terrible reputation for our village. You should have killed him. Anyway, when I met him, he, his 2 wives and 12 children were about to be removed from the breeze block shack they were living in on the outskirts of Bamako. He was free, but broken. Too old for physical work, illiterate and unqualified for any other sort of office work in one of the poorest countries on earth where there would be no opportunities for jobs anyway. And I felt, and still feel, that was the most harrowing interview I've ever done in over 30 years as a writer and journalist. And his last words I always remember very clearly: I have too much pain in my heart. I'm closer to despair than hope. So I was thinking of ending the book on that note, which of course, after that interview, it just felt, it was just too, heart-wrenching. And I looked for a different way to end this book. So with thanks again to the Pharos Foundation for sending me to Mauritania, recently called Slavery's Last Stronghold, I went to Nouakchott last year to take a look at modern slavery. Why Mauritania? Because again, like Mali, hereditary racialized slavery still continues under the radar there despite being illegal. How many are enslaved there? No one really knows. Estimates of the numbers of those enslaved vary enormously. In its most recent report, Global Slavery Index reckons that Mauritania is number 3 in the world for the prevalence of modern slavery, behind North Korea and Eritrea. They estimate that 149,000 people are enslaved in Mauritania. The local anti-slavery activist group I met, called IRA, reckons the true figure is much higher, as much as 20% of the country's population, or almost 1 million. So I suspect that the true figure is somewhere between the two. Anyway, the IRA anti-slavery activists introduced me to this remarkable woman called Habi Rabah, who, like Hami in Mali, was born into slavery. Both her parents died when she was a child. Today she lives in a tiny breeze block shack with corrugated iron roof in a sand-blown settlement 20 miles outside of Nouakchott. And she talked to me about her childhood, during which she told me she was regularly raped by her owner. She wasn't allowed to study or pray because she was told she had the soul of an animal. No days off, no holiday, no school, so she cannot read or write. She had to look after the goats during the day, the children at night. She got leftover food when there was some, nothing when there wasn't any. She was regularly beaten by the master, who fathered 2 children by her, neither of whom he recognized. In 2008, her brother Bilal took a police officer and an anti-slavery activist to her desert settlement and rescued her. And you can actually see the video when it happens. It's very extraordinary because she is denying she's an enslaved woman. She says, what are you doing here? And I'm not leaving. These are my family. And the brother is just trying to push her because he knows what's happening, because he escaped from slavery himself. And it takes quite a long time. The combination of the police officer, the activist, and the brother eventually almost just smuggling her into the pickup truck because she's protesting that she's not enslaved, because she's so terrified by what the family would do to her. Anyway, after that moment, 2008 liberation, she's never looked back. She ran for Parliament in 2018 and again in 2023. Of course, the odds are stacked against her in a country where political corruption remains endemic. But she told me she dedicated the rest of her life to fighting slavery, and so these are the words I ended my book with, and which I will end tonight's lecture with. When I came to Nouakchott, I realized I hadn't been living before. For the first time, I started to taste life. Before that, I was just an object. I didn't exist as a human being. Now, praise God, I'm free. Thank you very much.
Ethnic specialization among slaves. So, was your job as a janissary or a laborer or whatever it was it highly correlated to where you were captured or bought, or was it not so correlated?
Yeah, thank you for that very interesting question, and it varies. I think it varies especially according to categories. So, for example, I think it was asked in one of the last lectures about ethnicity on concubines. And the record generally show that Ottomans certainly, and I think the Arabs as well, not always as well documented, but that female African slaves were valued less highly as concubines than Circassian women, for example. Georgians always feature very strongly in that list. Janissaries, again, very, what's the word, Circassian again, Caucasus rather, Caucasian. Female African slaves heavily skewing towards domestic use, and that really is one of those areas that I felt in this book and in the research is one of the most silent aspects of it. There are various books and accounts you read, whether they're Ibn Battuta or 19th and 20th century, where you just hear someone referring to a slave in the background, a female slave. There's one extraordinary book in a sort of fairly aristocratic Turkish woman who describes how her father just comes back with a black African female slave for her as a companion, and they just make extraordinary remarks about the colour of her skin, the colour of her teeth, her spirit of resistance, and isn't she cute, and I hope she's not going to cause you too much trouble, in very strange language that people would be quite astonished to read these days. But the long answer is yes. There are, depending on what aspect you're looking at and which period, the Moroccan Sultan Moulay Ismail formed an all-black army. It's called the Abid al-Bukhari, black slave army. I think that was the 17th century, or possibly slightly later. So different periods, different times, different categories. Yes, there were. And I think with slave women, concubines particularly, going back to, I think it's an 11th century manual, the sorts of women from which parts of even the Arabian Peninsula they come from is studied quite closely as to what makes the most ideal or idealized concubine.
Why were the janissaries disproportionately Circassian and Georgian?
Well, actually, it's a very good question. I mean, generally, the Turks in older Arab writings are considered the great, but they're not Turks. They're Turkic from further east Central Asia, were considered the great fighting force, the most formidable soldiers that we mentioned, I think, in the previous lecture. I think one of the great attractions of the janissaries was the moulding of them, and get them early, indoctrinate them, convert them to Islam, change their names, and give them the best education you could, and also martial skills. And I think they proved their worth extremely quickly. The janissaries themselves came a little bit later than lots of the other the previous dynasties had used slave soldiers, and they were just simply the best and the crack fighting force. No, I feel I might be missing something a little bit on the janissaries, or have I missed something more obvious there?
Well, no, just to add
Sorry to just hurl that back. I just.
By the time they have such a large chunk of the organs, they're taking huge numbers their boys to go to this because they don't lose all connection with their
Yes.
family, and often they can be powerful patrons if they do make it good. And so in the 17th century, Bosnian Muslims start sort of bribing the Decime officials to take their side.
To get in.
Yes.
Yeah. Which was a really good point. Thank you, Noel. And it shows again that sort of slightly counterintuitive aspect of slavery in the Islamic world at times when it's a very attractive career option. You could go on to great financial success, social, political, and so on. So the janissaries are interesting for a number of reasons, including that, I think. Yeah. Thank you, Noel, and thank you for the question. I'm going to let the chairman take the questions.
Thank you. You talked about the denial of historic slavery in the Ottoman Empire. And of course, recently we've heard many claims of an underemphasis or ignorance of the transatlantic slave trade. And I wonder whether you would be able to hazard a comparison. And my other question is, more generally, how do you see morality and activism intersecting with research in this area?
Crikey. The first one, I'm not sure if do you mean ignorance of the Atlantic slave trade? Because I would say there isn't much ignorance, or we know so much more about it. I think in public discourse, certainly in academic studies. I think also for general readers, there's a much bigger body of work targeted at different audiences. So I think that's much better known. But unless I've misunderstood that question. Compared with the slave trade in the Islamic world, which I think is the study of it, I would say maybe not in its infancy, but it's a completely different level by comparison with the Atlantic slave trade. I think that's arguable.
What I'm really asking is, how do you assess the claims that we haven't been teaching slavery in schools, or haven't thought about it properly, or haven't given it its due emphasis?
Global slavery or the Atlantic?
Transatlantic.
The transatlantic. Well, I mean, I'm not an academic and I don't teach, and I'm not familiar with sort of contemporary curricula at all, so I wouldn't be able to give you a very clear answer on the teaching side. What I feel more aware of is general residual knowledge, and when you do something as simple as an internet search on slavery or the slave trade, what comes up again is almost invariably is the Atlantic slave trade, because I think that's just much better known and studied. I mean, you could say that both the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in the Islamic world are merely two important sections of global slavery. You know, ancient Egyptian, ancient Greeks, ancient China. But I've just sort of felt with this one, or this aspect of slavery, so concentrating specifically on the Islamic world, I mean, go and look online and see what sort of books you'll find. They're normally quite specialized, and aspects of it: Ottoman slavery, concubines, slave soldiers, the Mamluks, but not very much out there for general readers. And on your question on moralism and activism,
Yes.
and how they interact with.
Well, with the subject, just what are your impressions of the extent to which the study of history can stray into morality and activism? Is that desirable or undesirable?
That's a fantastic question. I feel like I either walk on ice or eggshells on this one. I suppose the thing that first comes to mind, though, to that question would be reparations. So I recently read a piece for a newspaper about a week or two ago, actually during the course of these lectures, prompted in part by a couple of follow-up questions and emails I'd received and Faros had received in response to one lecture. And I was expecting to be accused of either Islamophobia or being an Islamophobe. This went a little even further than that, really. I think talking about genocide and being likening me to a compromised academic from 1930s Germany, which I thought was interesting, possibly a little bit excessive even. So then, writing about reparations, I felt that again is an aspect of the legacy of slavery, which seems uniquely focused, or only exclusively focused, on the transatlantic slave trade. And there are some, many important advocacy organisations in the US, a little bit less in the UK, maybe looking at this. And Lenny Henry has recently entered the debate saying all the black British people should receive reparations. I didn't, without going so much into the morality of that, I just thought, as a historian, that's interesting because what about slavery outside that particular milieu? And if you had this sort of conversation, I would say in Istanbul today, maybe a bit less so in Istanbul, but raised eyebrows maybe, possible total lack of comprehension, or what on earth are you talking about? And this sort of conversation in the Gulf, I think you would, and I quoted an Omani friend who just said, well, it was business. What do you expect us to do? Everyone was taking slaves from Africa. We would have starved without it. Very straightforward, quite nonchalant, not particularly engaging with that legacy or what pain it might have caused or what moral questions might be engaged with. So I always thought there was just a very heavy preponderance towards one historical and geographical aspect of slavery in the world, as a global phenomenon. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. What would be some examples of verses in the Quran or teachings in the Quran that could be used against slavery? Because you mentioned that briefly earlier.
We covered. I covered it fairly fleetingly in the first lecture, looking at particularly some important verses. One of which, in particular, is traditionally seen as endorsing or justifying, legitimating the institution of slavery, and about how Allah has the master and the slave are different people, or different sort of classes of people. That's entirely normal and natural, which it was to that audience, of course, pagan, Jewish, Christian, new Muslim or otherwise. I think there were quite interesting debates to be had, or exploration of to what extent, if any, the example of the Prophet Muhammad and what is written in the Quran and then Islamic jurisprudence and Sharia law makes it difficult for a sort of God-fearing Muslim in different periods to say slavery is completely invalid. I mean, so those sort of two, in a way, cardboard cutout, hardline preachers might be considered completely, literalist, correct, doctrinally orthodox by other audiences. It depends. I think a lot of it is to do with literalism as well. What was written and decreed in the 7th century, and then the following centuries as the Islamic law and the Quran gets codified. How does that then look and feel in the 19th century, when largely the abolitionist pressures are coming from a sort of resurgent, largely Christian West? That it obviously has that message falls or lands in a very challenging way, I think, in the Ottoman Empire and much of the Arab world as well. So you're not going to find lines outlawing it. What you would find in the Quran, certainly, and in the body of law, is the importance of treating your slaves humanely, with compassion, and the very strong importance of emancipation, as much as wherever possible. It's your urge to be a good Muslim. To be a good Muslim is to free your slave. That's a very specific verse as well.
So, what about the role of various Ashanti and other empires in West Africa actually supplying the slaves to the Europeans who trade? Europeans initially didn't go into hinterland to do the enslaving. It was done by West Africans. And reading about it, was mentioned about how they, on the coast, they had meals together between the white Europeans and the black enslavers, and they just, as you said, just treated as if they were trading a commodity. And I know I read there's a novel written by an African American who found out her ancestors were involved in doing the enslaving. I think it's all the wells of Sulaco, I think. That's correct. So that, to me, is a big silence in terms of who actually was involved. It's not just purely Arabs and white Europeans.
Yeah, thank you very much for that one again.
I think Trevor Phillips, I think, said about Kenny, I don't know, but she said something, and he said, because we're very wary of people from Nigeria because they were involved in enslaving us.
Because lots of different ways to answer that, I think. I remember that female, I think she was Moroccan-American academic who I ended last week's lecture with, who was talking about it being a taboo to discuss it in Morocco, with this sort of added layer of, well, both skin colour, but also Muslim enslaving Muslim, which is a complete no-no. You know, it is illegal. That ties into the area you're talking about further south in the Sahel and West Africa. I didn't look at this in huge detail. I sort of came across it in looking in the 19th century, where you get it's kind of unusual, both I suppose geographically and historically, when you get the southern terminus of the Saharan slave trade, or where the slaves are being captured from, intersecting with the ones that are being taken to the west coast, and in that sort of clash or encounters, you have both Africans enslaving Africans and Muslims enslaving Muslims. I suppose traditionally, or some historians would say, you know, not your question, but this argument is anyway. I think it's highly contentious and contested rather, that the respective roles in that transatlantic slave trade. You know, say, well, so defenders would say, well, Africans were certainly involved in this, but they were serving a European market, and the participation was much more limited than what was almost sort of, you know, semi-industrialized system of enslavement. So I think it's an interesting area of studies. I think there's lots more work being done on it. It's controversial as well, but most of that work, I think, again, is being done on the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, and it almost feels as though there isn't even that necessarily level of you know, forensic study of the slave trade in the Islamic world. But yes, but there's obviously both African participation and regular instances of Muslim enslavement of fellow Muslims, which is very simply illegal. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.